Hello from Iceland. I will just begin. I hope you see my slides. You can see on the picture on the first title slide, the view. I'm sitting at the window in a summer house overlooking a river, very philosophical mode. So I hope the paper will be inspired by that. I'm going to talk about philosophy of the child. And most of, if not all of us who are here can undoubtedly remember a moment or an incident from childhood where they had an experience of philosophical thinking. Most often, we did not know at the time that the way we thought or experienced something was philosophical. In retrospect, after we got to know academic philosophy, we were able to describe this as a moment where we were philosophical, if not as the incident when we were born as philosophers. I have come up with my own moment from the age of 11, and I often go in my head to the place where I was lying all by myself in the moss on a summer day, watching the clouds pass by and wondering if it's my perception making the clouds move or if it's the earth that is moving under me, making the clouds seem like they are moving. Obviously, it was the wind that moved the clouds, so I was wrong on both points. Yet, from my perspective of later acquired knowledge of philosophy, it seems as if I was already wondering whether reality was a construct of our minds or an empirical reality. I also remember other kids posing philosophical questions out of the blue. Once the loudest and most unruly girl in 6th grade had a solemn moment and confided to me that she found it puzzling that one day she would no longer be in the world and that the world would not come to a halt but would continue to go on without her. All of a sudden, I saw this girl in a new light and was surprised and impressed by the depth of her thinking, even though I had no clue about existential philosophy at the time. This girl, who was bullied at school by other children and some teachers as well, was undoubtedly one of my first philosophical teachers. When I talk about the meaning of childhood for philosophical thinking, like I will do here, I am, however, not interested in examples like these about how children can, in fact, pose philosophical questions that are possibly indicative of more mature philosophical thinking. Such an idea about children as premature philosophers is in tune with very traditional notions about childhood, dating back to Aristotle, according to which children are seen as immature specimens of adult human beings. In line with such teleological idea of the child as an organism maturing towards some standard idea of an adult, the goal of upbringing and education is to facilitate that children learn to function as normal adults. This idea of an imperfect form of adulthood resembles the Aristotelian view of women as imperfect males. My above story about myself is therefore an interpretation of my childhood experience in light of my later acquired knowledge of philosophy. There may be some truth to such stories, yet they often sound like an attempt to idealize oneself as someone who was destined to become a real philosopher later as an adult. When I talk about the meaning of childhood for philosophical thinking, I also do not intend to discuss literature on philosophy of childhood, according to which children are seen as more capable to ask deep philosophical questions than adults who are not professional philosophers. Such literature is central to the growing and important field of philosophy with children, but it's not my topic here. What I like to propose instead is that childhood, how a child is born, how a sense of self emerges in the infant, and how a child perceives, senses, and gets into touch with the world can give us some clues to how academic philosophy can be re-enchanted, or academic philosophical thinking. I will be discussing philosophical thinking from the affective, experiential perspective of infancy and childhood as a way of connecting and orientating oneself in the world. This is based on studies of developmental psychology of childhood. I am therefore not disqualifying adult ways of philosophizing, proposing that maturity is not a useful ingredient of philosophical thinking. It obviously is and always will be. Nor am I suggesting that abstract, logical, representational thinking is redundant. We will continue to think philosophically in patterns, structures, and in line with logical rules, and the goal of philosophy will continue to be to offer comprehensive conceptual clarification. I'm also not saying that the child is a more authentic philosopher than the adult, since I'm not comparing the two in their philosophical capacities according to some standards of an academic discipline. Adult and childhood ways of doing philosophy in some kind of academic or school setting are different. My argument is of a different sort and is based on the sense that the training of philosophical thinking as abstract, logical, and representational thinking lacks cultivating a connection with lived experience. The child represents a way of thinking that is different from mainstream notions of the detached, disembodied, and disconnected way of abstract and representational thinking. With my claim that philosophical thinking needs to be reenchanted, I maintain that it needs to be connected more consciously with the embodied sources of thought that are already present in early infancy and continue to be present in adult thinking as neglected or repressed experiential and affective layers of our thinking. The training of philosophical thinking in academia is still neglecting findings of neurosciences about how the mind is embodied and embedded. We therefore need to develop better methodologies of training critical thinking in philosophy on the basis of such findings. But I am speaking here as a member of an international and interdisciplinary research project on methodologies of embodied critical thinking. But let me begin with the child, how we can learn something about such methodologies from childhood development. There are two philosophers who are the main inspiration for thinking about the child as a model for a more connected and more profound philosophical thinking, Luce Irigaray and Friedrich Nietzsche. For both thinkers, our culture calls for a new type of human being and a new way of thinking that replaces the old man of the West. And for both, the child represents such a new beginning. The child signifies for Nietzsche a new way of becoming that is embodied, playful, and yet totally connected to lived experience, present and aware. In Nietzsche's and Irigaray's philosophies of the child, we therefore encounter a criticism of traditional ideas that do not see the child cognitively and morally as a kind of its own. The embodied child interacts in perception and in movement with the world and is a figure for criticizing disembodied epistemological notions of cognitive neutrality and objectivity. Both Nietzsche and Irigaray would therefore like to see such a childlike disposition adopted by philosophers of the future to reinvigorate sterile philosophical thinking. Thinking this idea further, I argue that preserving the child within for us as philosophers is hence about connecting with levels of thought that are developed in infancy and childhood and that have been neglected in our understanding of philosophical thinking. This aspect needs to be understood much more precisely than merely as childlike wonder and spontaneity, which often have a ring of naivete to it. We need to understand the child as part of the human being that we do not outgrow. I'm not only talking about the inner child of popular psychology that we certainly need to tend to, but more specifically, the child as an embodied way of philosophical thinking. The genesis of the human being as a thinker during infancy and childhood is a foundation for understanding and deepening philosophical thinking. The cognitive developmental stages we go through cannot be understood as stages that dissolve when a stage is surpassed and a new stage is entered, like some theories of cognitive development have it. It is rather so that each stage remains operative as an integrated level in our thinking. The child is for Irigaray and Nietzsche a model for embodied thinking as a type of thinking that is needed not only to bring philosophy, so to speak, back to its senses. We need a more embodied way of thinking that connects us as thinkers through our bodies with all living. Our body is of the earth and allows us to connect with it. In face of the current and upcoming environmental disasters, we all know that a profound change is needed. If we are to change the economic, political systems that are non-sustainable and endanger the life of our species, a profound change in our way of thinking is required. And even if we are not able to change the big systems, we will in the coming decades have to adapt to changing environmental conditions in a way that will force us to be more connected to our natural and physical belonging, like both Irigaray and Nietzsche say. To get deeper into a transformative way of thinking, both Irigaray and Nietzsche advocate to go further by keeping company with a child that is within us. In this context, that means connecting with an embodied and sensory way of thinking that allows us to assess more consciously lived experience and the knowledge it has stored for us, and is a rich resource for thinking for ourselves as philosophers. The turn to the child as a philosophical topic is one aspect of the experiential and effective turn that results from a richer understanding of the mind as embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended within phenomenology and cognitive sciences. I am convinced that this connection from lived experience is a major reason for the environmental disasters that we are facing, like Claire Petit-Monchamp has argued. Our way of life and the ecological disaster it is bringing about originates in our blindness to that what is nevertheless closest to us, our own lived experience. But let us return to the child. In her recent book, To Be Born, Genesis of a New Human Being, Luz Irigaray adds an extremely important notion to common conceptions about the infant. Instead of viewing the infant merely as a bundle of needs, as has been common in 20th century psychologies and theories of childhood development, Irigaray points out how the newborn child is also an autonomous being. This strikes odd because we are used to view autonomy as something more mature as a result of proper education. Yet Irigaray opens her book with a notion of autonomy that is more primal as a kind of life force and a kind of a wonder. She says, "We have wanted to be born. Our existence cannot be the outcome of a mere chance, and our will to live clearly manifested itself at the time of our birth. We were the ones who determined its moment. We were also the ones who gave birth to ourselves through our first breathing. In spite of the long dependence of the little human on others for its survival, it gave life to itself to come into the world, and it gave life to itself alone. Now, obviously, the precise time of birth is a mystery that no science has been able to predict. A normal birth usually happens in the 38 to 42nd week of pregnancy. But no midwife or doctor has the means to predict precisely when a child will be born. Irigaray thus presents a speculative hypothesis about a scientific enigma by claiming that it's the child alone that decides when it enters the world. She also claims that the child's first breathing outside the maternal body is the first sign of its autonomous human potential. Education and upbringing should therefore center on nurturing this individual freedom to be oneself, in addition to fulfilling the needs of the child. Irigaray's conception of the child as a desiring and autonomous living being is crucial to her philosophy of the child and as a model for embodied transformative philosophical thinking. Philosophy is about thinking for oneself, to become oneself in thinking. If we do not only want to repeat what others have said, combine positions that others have come up with, but really think our own thoughts, we need to connect with experiential and affective sources of our thought, for they are the knowledge and the wisdom we have gathered from early on and make us who we are. We are a living process, a continuous becoming. Each and every person has a unique perspective on the world, and therefore any newborn, like Arendt also pointed out with her philosophy of natality, may be someone who comes up with something new and important for the world. This kind philosophers, like everybody else, must attempt to be and become themselves in order to connect with the source of their own thoughts. For Irigaray, self-affection is the royal road to accessing one's own thought. The term self-affection has nothing to do with narcissism or autoeroticism in a narrow sense, but is rather a kind of inner or felt sensing. It is a listening to oneself in thinking. This kind of sensing into as a form of deeper thinking begins with a meditative step that Irigaray defines as retouching. She refers to the morphology of the body, of the two lips that touch each other, and imagery of Buddhist meditation of fingers touching each other, eyelids closing and touching each other. Silence is also a precondition for this form of being with neglected layers of our thought in philosophy. This meditative state is like an opening of a door to a room where one is free to think and where we allow thoughts to arise and welcome them like a child we are pregnant with as something that is part of oneself and yet different and other. One approaches the thought with a friendly, non-judgmental attitude that allows it to form and show itself. This metaphor of the child as a philosophical thought also has implications for how we raise children in general. They require conditions where their autonomy for thinking and their need for self-expression are nurtured. We as contemporary philosophers also need to emancipate ourselves in thinking. We belong to a male-centric tradition, and we have been raised in an androcentric culture of philosophy that determines our academic profession. its institutional styles, as well as the content and basic concepts of philosophy. Irigaray therefore rightly asks, why does our culture constrain us to hold a discourse about the presumed objectivity of the world without taking into account our own objectivity, including at the level of moods, feeling, sensitive life? Feminist epistemologists like Sandra Herding and Donna Haraway have discussed for decades the need for extended objectivity. Such objectivity is about acknowledging how one's cognitive perspective is situated and positioned. Social context and tradition are part and parcel of how knowledge emerges and is produced. We are situated beings because we are embodied beings, born and situated in a place and time. Yet the kind of situated knowledge I propose here, with the help of Irigaray, Nietzsche, developmental psychology, and cognitive sciences, takes the situatedness and the perspectival nature of knowledge from social situatedness of gender, class, and other sociological norms and variables deeper into the embodied layers of human beings, into feelings, moods, and sensitive life. We are socially constructed by norms, values, ideas, conditions, and goals, and at the same time, we are subjective, experiential beings with a unique perspective on the world because we are all differentially located, situated, and conditioned. This felt situatedness is what gives us our individuality, which Ruth Hagengruber discussed in her opening address for this conference. Getting closer to ourselves, not as a narcissistic move, but as a move that increases plurality and deepens universality in the world. The more self we are in thinking, the better we are understood by others. And the more true we are to our own thinking, the better we can understand others. But how to connect with oneself? Let me illustrate it with an example of a basic entry point. The mere act of breathing, which is for Irigaray crucial to the kind of beings we are, is an effect of self-affection. For Irigaray, transcendence, as the basic movement of philosophical thinking, is initiated by touching ground with oneself in a self-affective gesture of breathing. The central concepts of touch and retouch underscore how philosophical thinking is embodied. And they also undermine a strict division of the subject and the object. Irigaray's metaphors of the lips that touch each other reverberate Merleau-Ponty's famous passage from his Phenomenology of Perception about the hands that touch each other, that show us that we cannot clearly distinguish who is touched and who touches. Touch is like a basic sense. The infant learns about the world through touching it and later putting things in the mouth. As a matter of fact, touch and hearing are developed earlier than vision. Cognitive sciences findings on embodied cognition have displayed the limits of vision-centric approaches to knowledge in our philosophical tradition. The emphasis on vision has contributed to upholding a strict distinction between perception that is directed outwards to an object and an internally directed perception of the body. Touch is also much wider than mere tactile touch. We are touched in thinking when some thought resonates with something in us. We can touch others with our words in a way that can hurt them, console them, soothe them, or enlighten them. Thoughts have a meaning for us when they strike a chord in us. Touch is a kind of background feeling a basic grasp on the world. The concept of touch refers therefore to our sense of being situated in a world in a subjective way. Finding oneself touched is a kind of first wave of an inner dialogue with oneself, of being two in one, like Hannah Arendt describes philosophical thinking. We are moved by something that motivates us to think about it. Coming to oneself in thinking is also a precondition for entering into a philosophical dialogue with another person. Embodied philosophical thinking therefore implies a way of dialoguing or talking philosophically with each other in a different way. In her book Conversations, Erik Rice states that entering into a dialogue requires us to use a language which touches, which involves sensibility, which preserves the role of the other in the constitution of meaning. There is an affective attunement in this type of dialogue that nurtures a deeper level than a philosophical dialogue that is comparative, like, for example, Habermas's formulation of the force of the better argument illustrates. The notion of affective attunement comes from research into early infant development that shows how the infant learns and adapts through affective attunement between itself and its mother or primary caretakers. This happens on a pre-reflective level where mother and child or parent and child attune their internal rhythms through gestures, sounds, and caressing. This rhythmic synchronization, which enables the resonance or tuning of two interior universes, is the basis of affective intersubjectivity. Where am I going with my idea that philosophers should nurture affective intra- and intersubjectivity? By way of a broader context, let me note here that my interpretation is very much directed at working out a theory of philosophical thinking that takes seriously the insights and experiences of many notable women philosophers. I am discussing Reenchanting philosophy by grounding philosophical thinking in the knowledge we gain through our own lived experience. Both Simone de Beauvoir and Hannah Arendt believed that deep philosophical thinking has a source in experience. This does not mean that feminist philosophers have to limit themselves to discussing empirically verified knowledge and that they cannot deal with abstract issues such as philosophy of mathematics. The philosopher is not a neutral, objective thinker who philosophizes from a point of view of nowhere, like Thomas Nagel pointed out. Philosophers are situated embodied beings, and their approach to abstract matters, like philosophy of mathematics, is also driven by how they have been touched by the world they live in, like I have discussed. Otherwise, we cannot explain why we are interested in certain topics within a philosophy of mathematics and why others leave us cold or disinterested. Being touched is not a one-way street of how society and culture influence and form us as thinkers. Being touched is at least a two-way street because there is always something within us that resonates with what touches us. Otherwise, we would not be touched if there were not something within us that makes us receptive towards it. This moment of resonating that Hartmut Rosa has discussed in his philosophy of resonance is a basic way of connecting with something. In the context of the philosophy of the child as a model of philosophical thinking, childlike wonder is most often emphasized. The child is seen as prefiguring the philosophical wonder that has since ancient times been seen as what triggers philosophical thinking. The philosophy of embodied philosophical thinking that I introduce here is situated earlier than at the moment where our philosophical eyes get wide open with wonder at something that puzzles us, amazes us, or appalls us. It is the level of thinking that precedes problematizing thinking of puzzlement and the value judgments involved in being amazed or feeling appalled. That type of feelings are more cognitive than being moved or stirred by something. Therefore, there is less value judgment in emotion than in feeling, which is a more reflective and cognitive level of being touched. Yet embodied thinking has its source on a level prior to feelings and emotions, and that is the level of affect. Affects are not mere personal feelings, but rather pre-personal and pre-cognitive intensities. To illustrate this, let me remind us of another child in ancient philosophy that represent better the type of embodied philosophical thinking I'm driving at than the child of wonder. Remember the boy in Plato's dialogue, Meno? Socrates questions him about geometry, and it turns out that the boy kind of intuitively figures out answers, as if he recollects knowledge that he already possesses. Plato describes how the boy begins with not knowing, and how this not knowing is something that refers to something he knows deep down, but has to reconnect with. Plato used this image to convey how the soul is immoral and stores immortal knowledge. With my philosophy of the child, I do not want to present that. I just want to point out two things to summarize this talk. My first point, we are embodied beings and our affectivity and cognition cooperate in our philosophical thinking. Hence, our lived experience and the knowledge it stores in us are part and parcel of our philosophical thinking. And really the source of us being independent thinkers. Critical reflected feeling is therefore also an important part of critical thinking. My second point, as embodied beings, we are of the earth and intertwined with all living and all things. Also here on the internet. Coming back to myself as a child, lying in the moss, I had a deep sense of being of the earth, of being of the cosmos. That was much deeper knowledge than my academic, philosophical, after explanation of having as a child been able to distinguish between realism and nominalism. The deep sense of belonging to something bigger than myself opened a space for philosophical thinking within me that has sustained me, has carried me, and helped me survive in an academic philosophy that is still so disembodied, so disconnected in its way of sterile abstract thinking, in its male-centric styles of dialogue, and its exclusive and excluding institutional cultures. Thank you.